You may be busy doing something while you listen to this podcast, but you're never too busy to eat healthy if you eat Vite Ramen. This podcast is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Show support for a sponsor that supports Moore's Law is Dead at the link in the description. And if you do, make sure you use offer code BROKENSILICON. And you can also support Moore's Law is Dead if you need Windows keys or software at cdkeyoffer.com. If you go there, also use the code BROKENSILICON for 25% off Windows keys or die shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. All right, now let's get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and I'm joined today by one of those guests where I'd say a significant portion of the fans of Moore's Law is Dead when I announce you're coming on celebrate in the streets because you have a level of insight. I mean, frankly, very few people on Earth have, and very few people on Earth come on to a usually gaming, but sometimes server podcast to give some insight that I just think is sorely missed, especially if you get stuck in this bubble of like talking about, oh, just this thing about the PS5, this thing about this graphics card, and you miss how it all actually works. But please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Nice to talk to you again. My name is Daniel Nenni. I've been in the semiconductor industry for 40 years. So I'm very active in the ecosystem. Currently, for the last 10 years, I've done mergers and acquisitions, so M&A with companies, IP, EDA, etc., companies inside the ecosystem. I work on getting them funding. I work on planning their exit and then executing exits. So I've done about 8 exits in the last 10 years, and I got a couple more in process. So that gives me some perspective. I'm also the founder of SemiWiki.com, which is an open forum for semiconductor professionals. We currently have over 240,000 registered members. So I started the company in about 12 years ago. And the reason is I didn't feel semiconductors were getting a fair shake in the media. And so we were the first semiconductor blogging site. And there's a lot of imitators now. But I think the semiconductor industry gets more than their fair share of media now. But it's not necessarily accurate. So myself and about a dozen other writers on SemiWiki, we all have master's degrees. Some of them have PhDs. We all have 20 to 30 or more years experience. So we're not journalists, but we can speak to the validity of tools and technology, and we can answer whatever questions you have for sure.
Mm-hmm. And I really wish there were more websites like this as well, because I find, I do Broken Silicon every other episode is like a news wrap up of the past 2 weeks of news. And depending on which website I'm quoting from, if it's a gaming first website, they usually know half of the stuff well, but are completely missing the business end. And if I quote from someone like, I don't know, Yahoo News or CNN or something, they'll talk about the business, the money numbers, but then they'll have these descriptions of what CPUs are in parentheses that are half the time wrong. Like when they try to describe why this new thing from TSMC is important, they will just describe it completely incorrectly. And there's been times mid article, summary that I've copied from Reuters or something that with Dan on the news episodes where we'll just start laughing mid sentence and go, well, you can tell this doesn't come from a semiconductor website with that summary there. But, so it really is an asset. But, you've been on a couple times before. There's a lot more backstory talk about where you come from and really the early days of Foundries and moving forward. I'd really recommend to anyone who hasn't listened to those episodes, listen to that, the first two, because they kind of just lead into each other. But one thing we talked about last time you were on that I thought we had to touch on again is the shortages, because it was funny, or at least interesting, maybe not funny, but the last time you were on, we were, it was late 2021. So we were right in the thick, the middle of the pandemic shortages. And we were both kind of giving our input on when we thought it would end. And it seemed like we both mostly agreed by the end of 2022, these shortages are pretty much going to be done, or certainly significantly better than what they were then, to the point that a lot of people would feel like they're done. Like, I was just wondering, now that we're kind of getting into some more normalcy, although certainly there's still shortages on some things here and there. How would you summarize what caused the shortages between 2020 to 2022 and really what made them start being alleviated?
Well, we know now, and it was always my premise that the shortage narrative was a false narrative. We had manufacturing capacity, and we do have manufacturing capacity that, can fulfill all the needs we have today. But what happened was when the pandemic hit, a lot of companies canceled their orders for manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So the utilization of our manufacturing facilities went from 90% to 70 to 60%. And when you turn off a manufacturing facility for a year, you can't make that up, right? You have to restart, and it takes a while, and then you get back up to 90 to 100% manufacturing, but you lost a lot of product. And so that's really what happened is people canceled, and the automotive companies, are a good example because we all felt that. But in the meantime, demand went up because people were working at home, right? So we're buying PCs, we're buying all sorts of things. I didn't think people would be buying a lot of cars during the pandemic, but they did. I actually bought a couple cars for my kids. And so, it was a double effect, right? For one side, we canceled manufacturing. Another side, we got a ton of orders. And that's what caused the shortages. The funny thing is people turn that into, oh, we have a manufacturing shortage. We have to build more manufacturing. And it just wasn't the case. And now we're saying, oh, we have to have manufacturing, in our backyard, which is kind of funny. And I'm all for it. I don't mind having fabs in the United States. I think it's kind of cool. But, when I started in this industry, I started in a fab, and this was, 40 years ago. And the reason why the fabs left Silicon Valley is because they polluted the hell out of the place. So the EPA threw us out. And, everybody says, well, it was cheaper. But sure, it was cheaper because there were no pollution standards in China and Asia. So, that's what happened. And bringing it back, semiconductors is much more cleaner. They do a lot of green stuff, a lot of reclamation of water and such. So it's not as bad of a deal as it was 40 years ago, but it's going to cost more, and that's fine too. But we're going to pay for it, right? The consumer ends up paying for the extra cost. But at some point in time, we're just going to have so much manufacturing, and then maybe prices will go down. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, and they're already starting to go down. Yeah, with the shortages thing, I think my favorite thing to point to, and there's certainly a few of these types of examples, is, everyone was scared, so they stopped making basically everything as much. And one of those things being cars. And they're like, well, people will buy less cars. And it's like, well, now you told people they can't fly. So no, now everyone's going to buy cars. Oh, well, people will probably buy less. I mean, for the subjects of this channel, less gaming devices. Well, no, now people can't travel as much or go to movie theaters, so maybe they want to play video games this fall. Like, it is. I guess I do kind of have like just one thing to add to that subject. Then, like, how do you feel in general just about? I think sometimes how much importance or credit we give to the ability of some of these forecasters to predict things when something as fundamental as people inside can't fly, now need car and need computer was missed. Like, that is you'd think if your whole job is to sit there and philosophize about what might happen, that might be the first thing you conclude is actually people are going to buy less of this and more of this. And then that's going to end and they're going to use them a lot less. And then we're going to have a glut of products, which we're seeing prices just fall apart in PC right now.
Yeah. Well, what happened was people panicked and they started double, triple ordering for the chip level. I'm talking about the chips. Mm-hmm. And so, if you follow TSMC, they quite, blankly said, we have record inventories in our customers. And they've been saying that for the last 6 months to a year. And so people built up their inventories, and that gave us a big year, in 2021 and 2022 was pretty good. But I think we grew 26% in 2021, which is a god-awful amount. Our industry has never experienced that. So you have to wonder, what's going to happen after that. And of course, we're going to have a somewhat of a crash because people just double, tripled order, and now they're using those inventories. The thing about cars, and, I'm also a pilot, and I bought a boat in the beginning of the pandemic because I wasn't able to travel. And the electronics in cars and airplanes and boats are more modular. So I was buying electronics, but they had modular components rather than a chip. So on a car, you have these modules that do take care of your brakes and all the other parts of your car. So it has to go from chip to a module, a subsystem, to the car. And so there's extra steps involved, and that takes a lot more time. And so that's why cars lag the rest of the industry and boats. I mean, I waited a year for a boat, and I waited a long time for my electronics and radar and such. But just the chips themselves, we freed those up, but there's a long wait time to get those into the subsystem and then get those subsystems into consumers. I think it's over now as far as the chip definitely shortage is over. It's been over for a while. But now I think we're seeing the subsystems, have caught up. So I think we're back to normal per se. Unfortunately, we have an economic issue right now, right? The inflation and maybe a recession. I think we've talked ourselves into. So even my family, we're spending less money just to see what's going to happen coming up in the next year. But so that's what you've seen. It's a roller coaster, right? So we went down and then we went up, and now we're going to go down again. That's very predictable. The industry's done it quite a few times. So it's just something we have to ride out.
Yeah, that was something I remember we talked about too the last time you were on, is the pessimism. I think what happened for like gamers during the pandemic shortages is they finally paid attention because, people were inside more. They wanted these things. They've always been able to buy these things. Now they couldn't. And so they finally started paying attention to it. And I think it all seems so shocking, that you couldn't get something because they've never cared. I think people just cared more than they did before. But we discussed that there's been shortages many, 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 many times of all different types of devices for decades. And that this really wasn't new. Maybe this had more of a like a microscope over it because people actually really did want these things this time, whereas before they were always, willing to wait a month or something.
Yeah, I think the media has helped in that because it's much more apparent, right? So semiconductors are front page news now. They didn't used to be, right? Nobody even knew what one was. But now you have the president of the United States, carrying around these wafers saying, hey, look, I got chips. So, we're just more front page news. And, so on SemiWiki, we do blogs primarily, but we also do webinars and we write books. I've written a few books, and I did one on the history of the semiconductor industry a few years back, and it was a bestseller. And I've seen a huge surge of people buying that book just over the last 2 years because of all the press and people wanting to know what's a semiconductor and why can I buy cars? And so, the media, it's partly to blame or partly to credit. People really know how important semiconductors are, not just in our homes, but, for the whole world.
Well, we're dancing around a subject here that I was going to get to later, but I don't see why we don't just get to it now. QH Freddy writes in and he asks, do you think the West, in quotes, can really ever be self-sufficient when it comes to semiconductors, as the politicians seem to want to make it? Is there really a desire to go into passives and PCBs? Can we ever make a self-sufficient electronics industry in terms of raw materials? Do we have enough young people with the skill or willing to learn the skills even here to run all the things that would be required to support this? And I think one thing I'd like to add on to that is just, and this is something I've discussed a lot, like with contacts behind the scenes, is it's not just the fabs. We bring the fabs here. It's, if you wanted to make a lot of these graphics cards in the United States, like where's the heatsink companies? Where's, the packaging company that assembles it all together? Like there's so much that would go into truly making a laptop from the ground, or, Xbox from the ground up just in the US. Do you think this is a realistic goal?
No. It used to happen in the United States, right? Because we invented semiconductors and everything was done in the United States. But there's a lot more to making semiconductors now than there was before. A lot more equipment, and a lot of these equipment companies are not in the US. So there's equipment that we can't live without that's not built in the US. And us building that equipment in the US is just not going to happen. That's just one example, but it's an ecosystem, and it's a worldwide ecosystem. Before the pandemic, I traveled all over the world, working on different ecosystem parts and, doing acquisitions and such. And it just taught me that, it truly is a worldwide ecosystem. And if you take away any one part, we're going to fail. And, trying to replicate that within one country, I mean, good luck. I think if you did, United States would probably have the best chances. But look at China. They spent hundreds of billions and billions of dollars trying to do this exact thing, and they've just failed. And, I mean, they've certainly put the money into it, which we haven't. They certainly have talent. It's just, it takes so much. And one of the challenges is the semiconductor industry moves so fast. So, China caught up to, maybe 20 years ago, but they're still stuck in a time warp. They haven't really been successful with FinFETs. We've had FinFETs for 10 years. In fact, we're moving on to the next technology. So, I just don't think anybody can do it. But if I was to bet on somebody doing it, it would probably be the U.S.
We have a lot of natural advantages in terms of like our resources, the size of the United States. I mean, I guess the follow-up question I would then have is, I mean, the short answer is no. What do you think is a realistic goal? Like maybe the combination of a few dozen countries could replicate what's being done if you take Asia and Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the US, South America into account. Like, is that the realistic goal, is maybe just we can cut out half of the places we're getting stuff from, but we're never really all going to get it from one country?
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're doing now, is we're reducing the number of dependencies. And so that's something that we can do. And, we ultimately could do it, but not in my lifetime, right? It's going to take 10, 20, 30, 40 years, before we even get close. And that's saying if we could. And it all depends on new technology. Where is it coming from, right? We just don't know. Certainly the U.S. is energized now. People are educating themselves on electronics. Everybody is aware of the semiconductor industry. So hopefully that builds a talent pool base that will allow us to expand and maybe one day be self-sufficient. But I agree, it's a good goal. You always want to work towards a big goal, but be realistic. It's going to take some time.
Samantha Vimes writes in and asks, what has been the impact of the CHIPS Act so far? Are the new fabs being constructed in the U.S. enough to change the manufacturing landscape?
Well, the CHIPS Act hasn't done anything yet. That money has not been distributed. And I think it's confused people, and, it's got a lot of strings attached. So I don't even really understand the thing altogether. I've read about it. I've done a lot of interviews. I have a podcast as well, and I've interviewed a dozen different people on this exact topic. And nobody really knows how it's going to shape out, and it's evolving. But, TSMC building a mega fab or a gigafab in Arizona is a huge, huge thing. And now they're looking at building in Europe. They're building in Japan. I think that is going to change the face of manufacturing. It's a very good thing. But again, it's going to cost more. So that's something we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have to live with. But I think it's a very good thing. And, it's interesting is if you look at the fab opening in Arizona that they just did last year, who was at that fab opening? Yes, the president of the United States was there, but the CEOs of Apple, the CEOs of Nvidia, of AMD, of all TSMC's top customers, they wanted the fab in the U.S. And they all came out and said, yes, we're going to use a U.S. fab. But, that fab is not going to be leading edge, right? It's 4 nanometer and it's going to be 3 nanometer, but TSMC is already shipping 3 nanometer from Taiwan. But it's important for these CEOs to say, hey, we can manufacture in the United States. So I think it's a good thing. But the other thing you should know is that those CEOs that participated in this opening, they have a lot of political power, right? I mean, these are key players in the technology sector, which is an important part of anybody's political base. So, the politicians pandering to these people and supporting TSMC, it's a very big thing. So that's politics, which I don't understand too much, but it's just an observation that TSMC has a huge base of people that are going to support them in this.
Well, you said something 4 nanometer, and that is one of the opening questions I wanted to eventually get to, just to set a baseline of understanding. It's something I'm sure we've discussed a dozen times, but I think is still maybe not talked about enough in what it really means. Alex Slaughter writes in and asks, hi, Tom and Daniel. I've read that the measurements applied to nodes such as 4 nanometer, for example, don't really measure transistor size anymore. What do they measure? Is it literally all just marketing, or are there differences between nodes that claim to be the same sizes that they're actually still referencing this point when they call a node a given name? If so, what are they?
Yeah, so we're just making things up now. When we started,
Okay, that's what I thought.
we used to use these flat transistors, planar transistors, and you could measure them. And so 28 nanometer is actually 28 nanometer transistor length. But when we went to FinFETs, they're three-dimensional, right? They have fins, thus the name FinFET. So we don't have a measurement anymore. The transistors are smaller, but they're taller, right? They have these fins. So we just make it up now. So that started at 16 nanometer and 14 nanometer and 12. And TSMC has done a pretty good job of leading the way. Intel now uses the same methodology for naming their processes. But instead of saying 14 nanometer plus and plus plus and plus plus plus, now they just give it another number. And so TSMC has N7, N6, N5, N4, N3, N2, N1. What's going to happen after that? Well, we'll go to some other cool name. I don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah, but it seems like, if I remember correctly, it was kind of real back, as far back as like 32 nanometer and then 28. And it just kind of became like they were bending the name and the rules a little bit into 20. And then my memory is like when 14 nanometer came, in quotes, Samsung and Global Foundries called theirs slightly smaller than TSMC. And I think their argument was technically, theoretically, it can be 5% more dense or something silly like that. And then TSMC got lots of questions. Why is yours not 14 nanometer? And they're like, actually, ours is higher performance than theirs, and over time, I think by 5 and 7, it's just, honestly, it seems like TSMC decides that I can call this a new number because it's at least 20% better overall. And now that TSMC does it, Intel and everyone competing with TSMC, because TSMC is in the lead, just calls it a similar number if they think it will compete with it, right? That's basically what we're at.
Well, you know what happened? So 20 nanometer is planar. So 20 nanometer actually is 20 nanometer. But Intel was the first one out with FinFET at 14. And TSMC was not as dense as Intel. So Morris Chang made this decision, and everybody was voting against him. They were going to call it 14. But Morris Chang said, no, you have to give Intel credit where credit's due. Theirs is denser. We're calling ours 14. And then Samsung came out and called theirs 14, and it was the same density as TSMC. So TSMC spent a whole note explaining to people why theirs was as good as Samsung. So they're
16 nanometer, yeah.
So they learned an important lesson. But TSMC has a new CEO. His name is C.C. Wei. He operates differently. He's a very sharp man. He's not going to let technology, get in his way of getting purchase orders from customers. So he's the one that's behind the aggressive naming, and it's worked amazingly, right? If you look at 16 nanometer, where TSMC shared the market, it went to 10 nanometer. TSMC, owned the market, and then at 7, Samsung did an okay job, and then they fell down at 5, 4, and 3. It's only TSMC. So their strategy of just doing, a half step, I call them, every year they release a new process, and they call it a new name. It's not a full process; it's a half step, but it has succeeded, right? I mean, they own the market now. They won the FinFET race. We'll see what happens next. We're going to carbon nanotubes. Who knows? It could be Intel.
Jessie here loves sticks, but it definitely wouldn't be healthy if I just let her chow down on them all the time, as much as she would like to. The same is usually true for reasonably priced instant meals for humans. It's easy to feel stuck looking for something that's quick to cook, tasty, healthy, and cheap all at the same time. Well, unless you consider Vite Ramen. This piece of content is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy for you to add protein and other ingredients of your choice to make a complete hearty meal, or their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy, microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break, whether at the office or at home. Click on the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% on a variety of different products, including special bundles just for Moore's Law's Dead fans, raw nudes if you want to make up your own recipes, and other food products, cooking utensils, and more. And when you order this spring, know that Vite just shut down for 3 months and relaunched their entire operation to improve speed, customer service, and just to improve things in the back end so they can keep up with how popular their product has become. Supporting them helps support me. And even just clicking on the link below makes a big difference. But I really do like their product and I recommend it. So if you're hungry for something that's healthy, cheap, and easy to make, check out Vite Ramen and use offer code Broken Silicon today. Well, so I want to start touching on that then. In the script, there was eventually to get to this TSMC 3 nanometer subject. I mean, right now we have rumors, I think, or not even just rumors. I believe in Apple's recent earnings call, they said they aren't getting the yields they wanted to out of 3 nanometer. There's always been rumors about that, but it seems like it's very clearly in the public now. TSMC says our yields are below what we wanted and the cost is up. So really, we're not saving much money moving to this new node. DigiTimes is suggesting in a rumor, I believe, that Blackwell is being pushed. That's NVIDIA's next GPU architecture, for those listening, is being pushed back possibly to 2025 instead of late 2024 due to issues with 3 nanometer. And, I've done a lot of AMD Zen 5 leaks over the past couple weeks. And there's always, AMD showed this publicly. Zen 5 on a roadmap, 4 nanometer / 3 nanometer. So they're always clearly designing to both. And everything I've seen from internal slide decks now is 4 nanometer basically across the board, besides maybe the successor to Bergamo or something. Everything else is moving to 4 nanometer. NVIDIA might be pushing back an architecture because of it. To your understanding, what's going on here with TSMC 3 nanometer? It is something we talked about in 2021 when you were on. Like, it seems like it's a little behind, but now it seems like firmly behind, right?
Well, so, I actually like gamer websites. They come up with some clever things. I think the worst website are Mac rumor websites, Apple websites. I mean, they're the worst. So here's the thing with 3 nanometer is it is 6 months late. And so it missed the Apple product launch. So last year we could have had 3 nanometer chips, but we have 4 nanometer, right, in our phones right now. And so, but TSMC's been open about that. And you have to understand the relationship with TSMC and Apple. It's an exclusive relationship. Apple only works with TSMC, and they get most favored nation status, which means they get the first process, and it's actually an Apple process. Only Apple gets it. So developing a process for one company for one product is much easier than developing a process for an entire ecosystem of customers, right? So this is a process specific for Apple. They don't name it. It's just Apple. And, you can call it 3 nanometer, but it's not really 3 nanometer. And so it's optimized for power because Apple does SoCs. And it's optimized for, big chips. And it's optimized for Apple devices. So that's all that's supported on the first 3 nanometer is Apple products. And so Apple gets first dibs. So Apple, wasn't able to get it in the 6 months. And TSMC and Apple developed this together. And so Apple is just as much at fault as TSMC if they don't hit the numbers. Because Apple says, I want this much power, this much performance, this much. And, TSMC tries to do that. So, this has happened before and it'll probably happen again. But I was just at the TSMC symposium last week. All the executives were there and they gave a status. 3 nanometer is on track. It's going to be in Apple products this year. You might see it in a Mac or an iPad before the phone, but I'm not sure if you will. But the yield, I saw the yield curves. The yield is actually much higher than 5 nanometer at this point in time. So, and they look at D0 defects and such. But N3 is doing quite well. In fact, N3 has more tape outs than N5 or N4 did at this point in time. And I know the ecosystem really well, and I know where the design starts are. And as far as 3 nanometer, it's all TSMC. I do not know one company designing at Samsung. So they have exclusive. I mean, they own 3 nanometer, but it is going to be a little bit delayed. But you will see 3 nanometer product this year from Apple, and then next year from all the top customers. Nvidia is on 3 nanometer. They're not with Samsung. Qualcomm is on 3 nanometer. They're not with Samsung. AMD, everybody. Intel is on 3 nanometer. They're also on 4 nanometer and 5 nanometer, but they're really going big on 3 nanometer. And so I think 3 nanometer will be the most successful node in the history of FinFETs at TSMC.
Now, and I think AMD at the let me make sure I understand. Yeah, so by the end of next year, I know AMD will be on 3 nanometer. There, and of course, there's with at least the dense version of Zen 5 for like expensive high core count options. But I guess what I want to ask now then is these rumors of like Nvidia possibly delaying Blackwell half a year. Let's keep in mind, even if it wasn't delayed, that's still a year and a half from now, late 2024. So a lot can change and it's quite in the distance. But like, I guess the concern is, my understanding is, top Blackwell is going to be that 500 to 800 millimeter squared mega GPU that Nvidia tends to do every generation now on the top end. These huge monstrous die sizes. Apple makes much smaller chips, at least for their iPhones at first. So do you think that if Nvidia is pushing back their top chip, if they are, it's not confirmed and things can change even if it was, do you think that it's because they really think TSMC is not going to be able to make it at the end of next year? Or do you think it's because of other factors?
No, TSMC is fine. They're going to get all the capacity they need. The thing is that I don't know which chip it is, but Nvidia, Intel, AMD, they're moving to chiplets, right? I don't know if you want to talk about chiplets, but it's a pretty big change. It's a game changer. And so, with chiplets, it's just smaller die, right? You're not doing the big monolithic die. You're doing smaller dies and you're hooking them all together. And what that allows you to do, it allows you to do dies on different processes. So you can have a 7 nanometer, 28 nanometer, a 3 nanometer. And so, that puts a little less stress on the semiconductor manufacturers, on TSMC, because, for example, with some of Intel's chips, I think they've talked about this publicly, only one die is on Intel, the CPU die. Then the GPU goes to TSMC, and the SoC, the IO chip goes to some other company, and so this is the way we're going to be doing business. Now, some companies like Apple probably won't do chiplets because they're in a phone, but Nvidia is doing chiplets. I guarantee it. I don't know which chip, but this makes it easier to design because it's easier to yield a smaller die. The problem is you have to hook all these chips together. And that is a very difficult thing. I've written a lot about chiplets on SemiWiki. I've done podcasts. We've done webinars. I actually spoke at a conference just last week, and we had experts on the panel from AMD, from Mercedes, from ARM. And, the census is that chiplets is very hard to do. I would bet if you see any delays with Intel or Nvidia or AMD, I would bet it's a chiplet issue rather than a die issue, because they're doing these smaller dies, easier to design to, easier to manufacture, easier to yield, but not so easy to hook together. So that's my understanding from the ecosystem. That's what people have told me. And, I talked to dozens of companies that do IP and EDA and foundries and ASIC services. And the consensus is that, chiplets is going to be a little bit of bump in the road of getting product out the door. This is not manufacturers. This is actual, packaging and getting the products, into the boards and the subsystems. So I don't know where Nvidia is at with that, but I guarantee you they're using chiplets.
Well, I spoke to someone at Nvidia about this. I don't know. At this point, it might have been a month or so ago. And what I was told is their next gen GPU architecture, of course, 90% of the lineup either way is going to be monolithic. But the top die, or the top configuration, I guess you'd say, I was told there's a chance it's chiplet, but I don't have a percentage, but he said it's a remote chance though, and the full configuration is still probably going to be this gigantic monolithic design, but they're trying to get a chiplet version working. But if they do, it's like, probably less. Again, this isn't something the person said, but let's say it's like 1 out of 5 chance they actually go with a chiplet design. If they do, it's not going to be like AMD's latest thing where, there's like 5 different things put together and it's really elaborate. It's going to be like kind of what Apple's done, where you'd almost argue it isn't chiplets, where it's 2 of the same thing, or, 2 big dies put together. The reason they're using multiple dies is to make it bigger, not so much to save on cost or use different nodes, right? At least that's what it sounds like right now. And talking to some people at Nvidia, it really sounds like they still think monolithic is the way to go for 90% of it that isn't like a hyper expensive AI chip.
Well, I don't agree with that because of the yield issue, right? So if you look at the wafer size, we have, a 300 millimeter wafer size, and you can only fit so many chips on that. And, all of a sudden you have 8 chips on a wafer. That's really hard to yield, because if you don't yield one of those chips, or if you have 10 chips on a wafer, you don't yield one chip, that's 10% that you lose, right? So chiplets is already happening. It has to happen because you can only get so big of a die on these wafers. And, Apple has a die size limitation because of the size of the phone, right, in your pocket. So they are in a different story. But companies like Intel, like AMD, they have to go to chiplets because they just can't yield these huge designs on leading edge processes in a short amount of time, right? And you can also say that, there's not enough capacity at 3 nanometer. So you can use 4 nanometer, 7 nanometer for chiplets that don't need to be as fast.
Well, yeah, that's what's happening right now, though, is NVIDIA's using 4 nanometer for or the 4N. It's, up for debate what it really is, but, for the Lovelace cards. And, well, they're very efficient, and the best samples of them are, the cut down ones needed to be cut down. And they're very fast. AMD is making something 80% as good. And it costs significantly less to manufacture because almost half the silicon's on 6 nanometer, and they're all smaller chips. So the 5 nanometer portion, you're getting higher yields, So I guess what I would say is, I think it just seems like something NVIDIA is working on, but they think they can out-design AMD. And actually, an interesting argument I heard is because AMD is using chiplets, this causes delays. And so, maybe their stuff's cheaper to make, but what if we launch 6 months before them? What if we have better software? What if because it's monolithic, our best yields are just better because they're just better. They don't have to waste energy communicating between chiplets. And again, NVIDIA's working on it, but that kind of shocked me both in a good and a bad way. It sounds a little bit to me like how Intel sounded when they were somewhat caught off guard by chiplets. But on the other hand, it does seem like NVIDIA is executing in a way that Intel isn't. And there's really kind of a crazy thing said in one conversation of like, eventually we want to be an AI company anyways, and we'll use chiplets for those $10,000 devices. But if eventually we're just making mid-range cards because of some, reticle limit, then I guess we'll just be making mid-range cards, and who cares? People will buy them. I don't know what you think about that opinion, because I'm sure some of those people are listening to this and they'd be curious what your opinion is on that approach NVIDIA is taking of just always trying to make sure they launch first, they don't overcomplicate things, then they have the best software. They can get chiplets working in a way that's similar to AMD good. If not, oh well, we'll be an AI company by then. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I've been around NVIDIA for some time, and I've worked with them, and I have a huge amount of respect for them. And I think they have one of the top CEOs in the industry. So I would never bet against them. But I do agree that a big part of their business is now software and ecosystem. So the actual chip matters less and less, I think, every year because of this ecosystem. And it's just like TSMC has this massive ecosystem. It's a huge competitive advantage. And NVIDIA has that for AI. And, I'm sure, I don't know if they planned the whole AI boom, if they knew it was coming or they just guessed, but, they hit it right on the money. I know NVIDIA is doing chiplets. I can tell you for a fact. I don't know when, but I know it's in process because I'm in the...
Well, they would argue Grace already uses chiplets technically, right? So they'd argue they already have some.
Well, so there's a difference between chiplets and packaging. We've packaged multiple die together for many years. It's called multi-die. Everybody does it. FPGA companies put 2 of the dies in and they double the capacity, and then they put a memory die in. But chiplets is a little bit different. There's some architectural issues that you have to, you're literally doing a separate CPU, GPU, separate IO, separate this and separate that. So it's a different type of thing, and it is more difficult, but the advantages are huge. So everybody's going to do it.
Mm-hmm. The thing too is eventually the reticle limit's going to get smaller on 2 nanometer, right?
Yeah.
All right, so I kind of want to start drilling into like the economics of chiplets and just silicon in general and what's going on here with cost. So Chris Rich writes in and asks, let's say for the sake of argument that AMD sells the Ryzen 7700 to distributors for, I don't know, $250. So, and I think that's generally sold. Let's say that, using a simple silicon calculator and looking at rumors of what TSMC wafer costs are, I would suggest that the silicon cost on this 8-core, 2-chiplet product is $40 to $45, implying that AMD, if they're selling it for $250 or certainly $300, is making massive profit margins on this. How accurate do you think silicon cost estimates that we constantly throw around online really are? Also, that doesn't include packaging, of course, testing, and a number of other steps, but what would you estimate the true packaging cost to be, including all other factors? And just to summarize, like, this is like a 120 millimeter squared 6 nanometer IO die, a around 71 millimeter squared 5 nanometer die, and of course, then it's packaged onto to go into an AM5 product, and there's a little heat spreader on it and stuff. Like, do you think that costs like $50, $100? Obviously, this isn't exact, but I am curious how much margin you think is on something like that.
I have never seen an accurate cost, and the thing is the cost I know are wafer costs, right? And it's very protected on NDAs, so I can't even say. But anytime I read about costs of wafers or cost of design, they're never close. In fact, they're usually over what that actually is. They used to say it costs $500 million to do a 3 nanometer chip. I mean, that's not even close. So
it's way less than that.
Yeah, I can't even comment. And it also depends on the type of chip and which type of company's doing it. So I pretty much ignore the costs associated with. I mean, leave that to the financial guys. But rumors, boy, I tell you, they're actually quite funny because they're never even close.
In terms of like it depends on which rumors, because every now and then, and I really treasure when I get access to this, I'll get like a bomb sheet. I got one for Ampere. I got one for this for the VR devices Meta's making. And so I'm like, well, here I go. At least when I look at chip estimates people are saying in the future, I can go, well, I know Meta paid this much for a gigabyte of RAM, and I know they paid this much for that, and I know they must be making this much profit. But I think it really varies wildly. I get most annoyed when I see estimates from companies around the consoles, because they'll say things like, oh, we estimate the PlayStation 5 costs $700 to make. And then a month later, Sony's like, we're profiting off of each one sold. And I'm like, hey, guys, it never costs that much to make these things. Like, what are you talking about? But I guess to try to drill in here, you have no doubt that like a 200 millimeter squared thing like is making high margins at $300 though. And like, because some companies are arguing right now, oh, no, it really costs way more. That's why we have to raise prices. And I think there's a lot of justified skepticism that some of these things cost as much as they say they do when they raise prices, and that it's really about something else.
Well, financial guys look through the company reports and they can come very close as to what things cost. But, again, I don't do that. And when I do see, a privileged document and I say, oh, okay, now I know what it costs. And then I do a Google and look at the media's, about what they say it costs. And it's never even close. So I don't even really bother with it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess to try to drill in on one thing here, though, because I'm curious what you think the strategy is around this. Like right now, AMD is planning to launch this graphics card called the 7600. It's going to be a 200 millimeter square die for a graphics card that uses about 180 watts or something. And it has 8 gigabytes of RAM on it. Now, there's a million ways I could argue if it costs this much to make relative to other things they clearly profited off of in the past. But my favorite example right now is a year ago, they launched the 6500 XT. That was also on 6 nanometer. That also had 8 gigabytes of RAM. The only difference is it had a 100 millimeter square die instead of 200. So my guess is that's about $15 in difference in silicon costs there. And yet, what that means is I think they could sell this thing with good margins that I know they had last year, because you can look at their financial reports. They were making tons of money with what they charged last year. I think they could easily sell this thing for like 280, 300, and maybe even making more money percentage-wise compared to the previous thing I was comparing it to. So I guess, when I hear behind the scenes that they want to charge between like 320 and 350, and yet this market is going like, people aren't buying things. They're super skeptical. You have tons of price drops happening week after week on a lot of these things that failed to sell as well as they expected. And yet they're still considering selling something for a margin that's clearly way higher than it needs to be. Why do you think they would keep doing that? Like, they can do this, have the margins that they say they want, which is like 45 to 55%. It can be at a price that I know would be attractive, and yet they're considering a price that I am sure no one's going to want this for. And we've seen Nvidia and AMD jump back and forth with tons of launches this year doing that. Why do you think they keep doing it?
Well, probably because they can. I really don't know. But I do have a comment about AMD. I mean, have you seen the change in AMD since they went to TSMC?
Well, I mean, you'd mean in terms of success or
Product?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's just huge. And you can credit Lisa Su all you want, but the AMD relationship with TSMC is really epic. I mean, TSMC does their packaging, right?
Mm-hmm.
TSMC provides a full solution for them. So what AMD did, years ago to what they do today is completely different. In fact, even what they did 2 years ago to what they do today is completely different because the relationship has expanded. I can't imagine AMD making worse margins today or moving forward. It's only going to get better because that relationship with TSMC is really, really close. Nvidia doesn't have that relationship. They've been at Samsung for a while and they've been hopping around. If you're exclusive to TSMC, you get access to data. You get different types of relationship. Apple, AMD, have the closest relationship. And it really makes a big difference in how their products are made. And margins is a big part of that. I mean, TSMC does a really good job for AMD. AMD also, I don't know if you realize this, but they bought Xilinx. And Xilinx started the whole packaging era with TSMC, CoWoS, and now they have Infos. And at the conference this week with TSMC, they went through all their new stuff. And there's AMD, in all their examples, or in some of their examples. So I saw architecture pictures. I have some of the slides of all the AMD chips. And it was just incredible. And, so I really have high hopes. So I wouldn't bet against AMD right now.
Right. But it's just they think they can get away with charging that much. That's the answer then, basically.
Well, if they have a superior product, they can. And as far as advancement in their GPU technology, I think they've done quite a good job against Intel and Nvidia. I think moving forward, pricing for these products is really going to be dependent on the manufacturing. And, manufacturing is expensive and it's getting more expensive. And so if you use chiplets, you can save a lot of money and you can save a lot of time and you can save a lot of design time and you can save a lot of time to market. So, maybe AMD is building up to that, but it's going to be a big competitive issue. And I can tell you that AMD, as far as, those types of companies, they're by far ahead in the chiplet race. So, I have high hopes for AMD.
Well, you touched on this though, so I want to get to it. Dino999 writes in and asks, I've seen it mentioned many times that TSMC is making Nvidia pay for their wafers. To my understanding, a big reason is because Nvidia decided to use Samsung for Ampere. How does Nvidia's current relationship compare to TSMC faithfuls like AMD or Apple? And do you have any insight into how TSMC decides to treat each individual customer, since it doesn't seem to be a level playing field for those that try to get involved making their stuff at TSMC next to AMD?
Well, here's the thing is if you're exclusive to TSMC, you get access to things that people who are not exclusive do. So, it's a couple of reasons. One of it is financial, of course, but it's also competitive information and, intellectual property. If your team is designed into TSMC and Samsung, there's going to be leakage. And so if you're going to go to TSMC exclusively, you're going to have first access, you're going to have full access. If you have teams designed into other foundries like Nvidia and Qualcomm, you're going to have much more limited access. And so that's how it is today. And it's been like that since Apple came to TSMC. And, it makes sense because before FinFETs, people used to design to TSMC and then they could take the exact design to other foundries and manufacture them. And, it's not really fair for TSMC because they do the heavy lifting and then, the volumes go elsewhere. So TSMC has been very protective of their IP, and one of the ways they do that is limiting the information that's given to customers. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so if you're exclusive like Apple and AMD, you get first access. You know, Apple gets their own process. I mean, Apple prepays. You know, they buy fabs really, but you know, if think about it, if you have a company like Nvidia that's developing to both Samsung and TSMC, how much do you trust them with your information?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know,
And so, like, I've heard like a key thing about TSMC working with them compared to other foundries is how good they are at working with your hard design team on making sure it's as efficiently designed for the node as possible. You're basically saying, well, if you're AMD and you're only building stuff at TSMC, then TSMC can say, hey, there's this way to get even more efficiency out of this node if you do this. And they're more reluctant to say stuff like that to NVIDIA, right?
yeah, or they can give them access to the PDKs early. They can give them customized PDKs. You know, it's stuff like that. So, you know, and the problem is, you know, it becomes a monopolistic thing where, you know, all of a sudden TSMC has a lock on every customer, you know, and you can't have that as well. So, you know, it's a balance. But NVIDIA, you know, has made a practice of going to multiple foundries, and good for them. It's unfortunate that Samsung has just screwed everything up. You know, if Samsung was more competitive, I think we would be better as an industry because it would push TSMC even faster. You know, who's pushing TSMC? Well, nobody right now. Hopefully Intel does, but
Mm-hmm.
Samsung has just completely blown it. And I think Qualcomm and Nvidia are making some big changes. At the TSMC symposium, the new Qualcomm CEO stood up and just, you know, sang praises to TSMC. And so things might be changing between those two companies. They have a new CEO. TSMC has a new CEO. You know, they do business differently now. Nvidia, same CEO. So I don't know if that's going to change, but I would bet that Qualcomm is going to be much more TSMC dependent in the future than they have been in the past.
Well, you know, and I really want to jump in here and say this because I haven't really read into who's saying this or why it's being talked about on Reddit or whatever. But I saw some rumors circulating last week that like Samsung's 4 nanometer might actually be as good as TSMC's or something. And I just got to be clear to everyone listening to this. One of the conversations I had with somebody at NVIDIA a couple months ago, this person said, by the way, Samsung's latest node sucks. Like, there's no way we're going to their newer stuff anytime soon. And so I do want to be clear about that. Like, because I've seen some wild rumors, as I often do online. I think maybe even at places like DigiTimes and stuff that Samsung's node may actually catch up to TSMC because of 3 nanometer delays. And I don't know how true it is that Samsung may make up some lost ground, I guess. But what I can say is the people actually working at AMD and NVIDIA do not want to go to Samsung's latest node, and they only have bad things to say. So I do think at least this year, TSMC is still very firmly in the lead.
Yeah, so this is one of the advantages SemiWiki has because we get invited to all the conferences for free, right? And it's huge. It saves us a huge amount of money. So we go to the conferences, IEDM, you know, SPIE, ISSCC, and people present papers. Samsung is a prolific paper presenter, and it's very good because it gets other people to present papers. So we look at the Samsung paper on the different processes, and I have 3 process experts on staff. And we look at the papers and we say, wow, you know, good stuff. They say that they're the densest. They give their SRAM density, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's great. So yes, maybe better than TSMC on paper. And then we go to the companies themselves and we ask questions, right? And Samsung is the worst at answering questions. They are the absolute worst. They used to be a sponsor of SemiWiki. We used to work with them, but we don't anymore. I mean, we don't like them because they just don't tell the truth, you know? And then we go to the IP companies. And that's where the rubber hits the road. Because if you have to have IP before you can do a design. And if you're doing IP, you're first access to the processes, right? So ARM and the Cerdes guys and this and that, they all have access. And, you know, they tell us, yeah, you know, Samsung's got a great process, but guess what? The PDK is not usable. And the PDK is the interface between the process and the design, right? So if your PDK sucks, you can't use it. You know, it doesn't matter what your density numbers are. So that's the problem with Samsung is their PDKs are really bad.
Well, you know, that's something I just hear about in general is like the fact that TSMC is easy to work with. If there was a competitor that had a slightly better node, it would have to be more than slightly better, or it'd have to be way cheaper for them to consider using it just because, let's say Intel or Samsung has a node 10% better than whatever TSMC's latest node is. The fact that TSMC is so competent, easy to work with, helps you so much in the hard design, you probably take that 10% haircut, should have that peace of mind that you will get the yields they told you would get, and you will launch on time, right?
Yeah, that's mostly the ecosystem. So, when you build a design, you have to have tools, and TSMC verifies that all the tools work and that are silicon proven, and same thing with IP and everything else. So it's all about the ecosystem. You say TSMC is easy to work with, but it's the ecosystem that's easy to work with, right? Mm-hmm. So TSMC has verified everything. They have all the files. You just go on the TSMC side and click, say, hey, this is the IP I want to use. Oh, well, here's some that have been used, in a similar application. They're all silicon proven. I can sleep at night, right? So that's the ecosystem at work. But, TSMC is a very customer-centric company, very customer-centric culture. So, I've worked for them for 25 years. They've never led me astray. So that's why I'm a big fanboy. But I don't think it's a good idea to only have one foundry.
No.
And, TSMC understands that. So that's why, I was really a big fan of Global Foundries in the beginning. But boy, that was a dumpster fire. And then, I cozied up to Samsung to see if I could help them and get them, a little bit more friendly, but that didn't work. Now I'm, I'm hoping on Intel. And, Intel has a foundry group right now. And, I know them fairly well because a lot of them are from TSMC and Samsung. They've hired very well. But it all comes down to the PDK. Intel knows how to build manufacturing. They've been doing it for years. They might even be the best at it. They know how to build processors, world leader. But when you have to do a PDK for your own product versus a PDK for foundry for hundreds of companies, it's a very different thing. So the question is, will TSMC be successful in the foundry business? It's all about the PDK and the ecosystem. And hopefully they will be. My fingers are crossed because we don't want one foundry. It'd be nice to have three, but at least two.
Ever feel like a dog chasing its tail as you scour dozens of eBay postings and seedy websites looking for a safe way to get reasonably priced Microsoft software? Well, you don't have to do that. Just go to cdkeyoffer.com. This piece of content is sponsored by cdkeyoffer.com that offers both Microsoft operating systems, Office products, select games, and even some gaming hardware peripherals for reasonable prices. And they've been a sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead and the entire team here for years for a reason. They've been good to me. They've been good to Dan. They've been good to dozens of me and Dan's family members and friends for years now. And they've also been good to the Moore's Law is Dead community. So whether you're looking for Steam, EA, Uplay, or PlayStation keys, or of course Microsoft products or gaming peripherals, support Moore's Law is Dead by using the offer code BROKENSILICON for 25% off all Microsoft products and Die Shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. Support Moore's Law is Dead by supporting one of our best long-term sponsors, cdkeyoffer.com today. So, perfect way to transition then. Samantha Vimes writes in and asks, if you had to give a percentage chance, how likely do you think it is that Intel is able to become a successful fab for outside companies in the next 5 years? If you think the chance is low, what do you think the roadblocks are? And if you think they can get what gives you, and if you think they can get there, what gives you that optimism that they can? And, this is, I guess I'll just throw in here too, talking to people at Intel, it really seems like a lot of their delays right now for all of these products is the design side for the most part. It was certainly the foundry side for a bit there, although one could argue the designers have to take some blame for giving them designs the foundry couldn't make. But what I'm hearing talk to people in Intel Foundries is they're ahead of schedule. They're hitting their targets. Everything seems to be good. And then they get given this Meteor Lake stepping and the thing doesn't work. And the Meteor Lake design team's kind of asking, well, what if we change the rules here under this? And they're like, well, no, you have to design and build to this. And I just see that as a major headwind, but also an interesting idea of like what could happen, what type of company Intel could be foremost in 5 years. Like, do you think they're going to get there though, where they could be a foundry that is seen more as a foundry, not as something that makes the most advanced chip designs? And yeah, I mean, that was Samantha's question.
Well, so I think Intel Foundry's goal is to be the number 2 foundry in 10 years. I think I heard that somewhere. And I think they could do it in 5 because Samsung is just horrible, right? And so customers will do anything. So there's 2 types of business. There's the business that Samsung has relied on, which is the not TSMC business. Those are companies that don't want to do business with TSMC. So not TSMC. And Samsung, actually, their wafer prices are very good. They're about 20% less than TSMC. But, that just tells you how crummy their PDKs are. It's like, I'm not even going to pay, 20% more to go to TSMC, because the PDKs are just unusable. So if they could use Samsung, they would. But the bottom line is they can't. So Intel has an opportunity there, but they can't use pricing, right? Because they can't charge 20% less than TSMC because, their pricing is probably more than TSMC.
That's what I hear, by the way. Their nodes are not cheap to use. Sure, they're using their own nodes, but they're still very expensive.
Yeah, well, for the foundry business, it's their own node, right? So, but they have to have a technological advantage, right? Or they're just going to get the not TSMC business, right? So, you want to get business based on your competitive merits. That's how you grow in this industry. So, Intel 4 is fine. By the way, Meteor Lake, in my opinion, that's a chiplet problem. That's one of the examples I told you. Meteor Lake. And so Meteor Lake has, 3 different processes in the chiplets, I think. But Intel 4 is fine. I heard something that said Meteor Lake is delayed because Intel doesn't know how to do EUV. It's like, that's
not what I've heard. I've heard it's the design team getting the chiplets to work together, and they're on like their 12th stepping or something. It's not that the node itself doesn't work.
Well, it's a chiplet problem is what I understand. And, that's based on experience, right? This is their first, big chip with chiplets. And so they'll get over that. But it's not a process problem. So process is fine. So Intel 3 is fine. But, people really aren't going to use Intel 3 for the foundry because TSMC 3, everybody's been taping out to it. It works. Some people will use Intel 3, but it's not a big competitive advantage. Intel is also working on 18A, which is the first, gate all around. And a lot of people are interested in it. And so that could be the big breakout node for TSMC, or for Intel against TSMC. Samsung's 3 nanometer is the comparable to Intel 2 Intel 18A and TSMC 2, but it doesn't work. Samsung really botched it. And so are people going to go back to them? I don't know. It's kind of hard after you fail really hard like that. So, the question is, will TSMC's N2 be competitive with Intel 18A? Well, no. At the conferences, at the papers, yes, it's going to be ahead. But the PDK is the critical point. So we don't know yet. Right? So the N2 PDK is not out yet. The 18A PDK is still being developed. We'll know in a year. But Intel could be a big winner here. I'm hoping for it. But again, if they botch the PDK, then it's another TSMC, monopoly.
Right. So, yeah. And that's what it sounds like, or looks like to me too, is, you align where things are going with TSMC, you align where Intel's trying to get, I hear Intel's fabs are making progress, and you go, oh yeah, in a couple of years, Intel may have at least a slightly better node than TSMC. But you're saying that's what's going to be critical because no one's interested in a node that's similar to TSMC but is not made at TSMC. They'll only go to Intel if they can actually beat TSMC in performance first. And 18A is going to be critical for finding out if that happens, basically.
I hope so. And, Intel's also got the Made in America thing, right? So 18A is going to be, big in the United States. TSMC won't have N2 in the United States anytime soon. So it could be, made in America, blah, blah, blah. But, and then there'll be not TSMC business, right? You want to put business in another fab. But the big swing is it's a very competitive node. And in that regard, Intel is known for their high performance, right? So, and that's a big part of the business, HPC. So Intel could get a lot of the HPC foundry business if they have a better performing node.
So Samantha Vimes writes in yet again and asks, How much do you think TSMC is squeezing the market right now then? If Intel got their fabs to be competitive and started securing contracts, do you think TSMC would be forced to cut prices? Do you think this would affect newer and older nodes at the same time, or just the newer ones, and why?
Now, TSMC won the FinFET war, right? I mean, they have the best yield, the best performance, the best density. They have the best ecosystem. I don't think there's any threat to TSMC in regards to the FinFETs. It's what's after FinFETs. Sure, they'll get FinFET business because of the not TSMC, business model. But competitively, they're not going to win business against TSMC on FinFETs. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah, and it's funny. I've heard, and I don't have any exact numbers, but I've heard suggestion that like the current 10 nanometer node Intel's using for like Raptor Lake, that actually costs more to make than not only TSMC's 7, but their 5 nanometer. And that basically all of Intel's older nodes aren't cost competitive with the TSMC, 28 nanometer and 16 nanometer stuff. And so, yeah, I guess you're saying there's really no reason for them to use older Intel nodes, only the newest stuff if it's cost competitive, right?
Yeah, and TSMC has low power, and Intel is really not known for that. And, TSMC just has a lot more experience at a broad customer base with these nodes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Intel has been focused on microprocessors. So they're having to retune these processes for microprocessors. And that's fine. And I'm sure they'll get some business, but it's not really going to make a big difference. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to take business away from Samsung, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, here's the thing is if Intel can beat TSMC to the next node, to the nanotubes, et cetera, that will be huge. And that will get them business in all regards. But, it could happen. It couldn't happen. You asked for odds, 50-50,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just because of the PDK. It has nothing to do with the process technology. I'm completely confident that they're very good at EUV. They're very good at manufacturing, the best in the world, probably, for high performance manufacturing. But that PDK, that ecosystem is very difficult.
Well, so here's an interesting thing, though, about TSMC versus Intel nodes. It does seem like there was this move a few years ago after the whiplash of their 10 nanometer delays to make sure they could design at TSMC if they needed to use TSMC. But the fact of the matter is, even if you can make something at TSMC, that really doesn't change that Intel kind of has to fill up their own fabs or they're losing a lot of money. And from what I've heard, mobile Arrow Lake late next year will be on their own fabs, 18A, I believe, or I think it might have been 20A. But the desktop version supposedly going to be on N3X at TSMC, which is funny because I think, they said, well, TSMC's got this great node. The X version clocks extremely high, perfect for desktop. If it so happens that our node gets delayed, we can use the TSMC design everywhere instead of our own 18A design. Perfect. But what's weird is I'm like, well, now their foundries are ahead of schedule. A lot of their chips are being delayed. If they make the working version at TSMC and aren't filling up their own fabs, I don't know. Like, that's a huge money sink right there. It's almost like they should have designed Alder Lake at TSMC and everything else at their own fabs, because that's when they actually needed it to be at their own fabs for financial reasons. I just kind of want to use this also as an opportunity to jump into the conversation about Intel's earnings, because from my perspective, the worse Intel's earnings get, the less I have to say about them. It's like, I don't know. These are really bad numbers. They look worse than last quarter's numbers. And I see them axing department after department after department. And I go, I just worry, like, I have no doubt that like these things they're working on, like Arrow Lake and Diamond Rapids, are going to be great. And sounds like their foundries are on track, but I'm concerned they're going to be a company that's very, very, very wounded by the time they even get to the stuff that's competitive. And when they do, it looks more expensive to make than what AMD is making. So I guess, I don't know if you have any thoughts on Intel's earnings, and if you feel like there is somewhat of a race against time here, where it's like, yes, they have cool things coming out, but if those things cost twice as much to make as their competition and they're out of money by the time they launch, I mean, what are we going to do about that? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do follow the earnings. I'm not a financial guy, but there's always discussions on SemiWiki about earnings. And I go through the TSMC earnings with a fine tooth comb because I know more about that. But I did look at the Intel earnings, and there's a thread on SemiWiki about it where some guys who know more about it, and some guys were impressed with it. It was surprising, and some people were depressed. But I think the economic uncertainty in the world is weighing heavily on Intel, and I don't think their demise is of their own doing, at least quarterly. I think Pat Gelsinger is a great leader. I know people that work for him. I think he's doing a great job, but he got handed a couple curveballs, since he took office. And, it's a difficult time. And I don't think that it is non-recoverable. In fact, I think they're at the bottom now. I think that they will have a better quarter next quarter, and I think it will be on the rise. I personally think next year is going to be a great year for the semiconductor industry, and Intel is in a good position for that. The whole manufacturing thing is the difficult thing. Some people say Intel should be fabless. Some people say, split out the fabs. I don't think so. I think Intel's strength is the ability to, design, manufacture, and do software. Intel has a huge software component, and software is important now for chips. In fact, it is. Look at Nvidia. Where would Nvidia be without software? Right?
Mm-hmm.
They have huge catalogs of software ecosystem. It's the same with Intel. They have a huge amount of software stacks, all sorts of things. And so the combination of that manufacturing design and the software, it's very powerful. And I think you're going to need to keep that together. But I don't think they've really realized the real value in those three different pillars. Moving forward, mobile is always going to be big, but the biggest driver in the industry is AI.
Mm-hmm.
And, you see the chat stuff. I've seen it. I have high hopes for AI. It'd be nice if AI did background checks for people, when they get jobs and when they get weapons and everything. I think AI could do a lot better job at that and many, many other things. But the one thing about AI is it's going to take a huge amount of performance, a huge amount of power, huge amount of memory, and a huge amount of software. And I think Intel's well positioned for that. So I think AI is going to help them out quite a bit.
Yeah, I guess, you brought up Nvidia though with software, and yeah, they launched, they argue, their Alchemist graphics cards, which have had just dozens of software issues. And granted, this is hard to do graphics cards, so software issues were somewhat expected, but it still seems like the amount of updates, from a gamer's perspective, they're pushing out per month, they're actually not pushing out as many patches, or should I say like driver releases, as Nvidia and AMD to this day. And so I guess I'm just concerned though when it comes to software and really everything you mentioned, like, is this just a behemoth that's still this aircraft carrier that takes forever to steer? Because at least when we see products come out, they still don't seem to have the software they need to have. They don't seem to have it to this day. And is there just a chance that, like, because Pat was acting very, very cocky a couple of years ago, and he seems to have backed down on the cockiness recently. You think there's a chance he underestimated how much strength it's going to take to turn the steering wheel on the aircraft carrier? And that is there, because I don't want to make it sound more doomish than I will mean for it to, but like, how much of this is just like a momentum issue that wasn't someone didn't grab the steering wheel soon enough, and like all of this is still gonna all happen? Because I hear about better server products coming from Intel, and yet I hear all my server contacts saying, well, we're going with AMD because they've proven themselves for 3 years in a row. And it just seems like laptops as well, everyone's just switching from Intel, and their revenue's down so much. I don't know. I just wonder. I agree that they should be able to do all of these things, but how much of this is just hitting the brakes on a train, and they didn't hit the brakes soon enough, and so it could just be much, much bumpier over the next 2 years than it really ought to be. And then Pat probably thought it would be.
Yeah, I think the pandemic really, put a damper in his plans, and it's going to get worse than you might imagine, because not just AMD, but a lot of these companies are building their own chips. So Google and everybody. And I've been involved in a couple of projects with these companies, and it's kind of interesting. They develop chips differently than most companies. They have huge checkbooks, and they spend a huge amount of money on developing these internal chips because they're not selling them, right? It's only for their own use. And the cloud is, hugely competitive and hugely profitable. But, the amount of Intel chips that are going to be in these servers are going to be reduced. Instead of being the compute horsepower that, of yesterday, they're going to be housekeeping chips because the power performance type stuff is going to go to their own, their own chips. So Google is making these amazing chips. Amazon is making these amazing chips. All these companies, Microsoft has a huge chip organization, and even Facebook or Meta. And I see this on SemiWiki. I see all these domains coming, and Airbnb is making their chips now. And it's like, what are they doing? I have no idea.
I don't know. That's when I'd worry there's some kind of a bubble there or something, but who knows? Maybe they'll make a good chip. I don't know.
Well, maybe it's going to be spy chips so they can spy on us.
Well, you may find this funny in terms of I didn't know a company was working on something. I was looking at Duolingo, just, a language practicing app. And in between language sessions, it said, "Did you know we're now in real estate?" And I'm like, why is a Rosetta Stone competitor selling houses? That can't be a good sign. Or that's what I think of when you say Airbnb is making their own chips.
Yeah, well, when I see them on SemiWiki, then I look on LinkedIn, and I actually know people that work at there, and they used to work for Google and Intel, and it's just funny. But the point is domain specific chips are going to come back to this industry, and it's going to come back in a big way. And these people who are doing their own chips, like Google, they don't mind spending huge amounts of money on chips.
Well, they have the money too, and
they're spending it on software. They're spending it on IP. It's just an incredible boom for our ecosystem. But I would say that would be the most worrisome thing about Intel. AMD, sure. But we're seeing a change in chips of how they're developed. System companies are making their own chips. And, it started with Apple, but car companies are making their own chips, right? The funny thing about the conference, C.C. Wei, the CEO, went up there, and he's a funny guy. He likes to make jokes. And he said, I'm best friends with all the CEOs of the car companies now because they called him directly asking for chips. And it's I'm sure it's true, but it's just kind of funny. And the other thing he said that was funny is he didn't give a forecast this year, which he normally does. And he said, my last forecast was so bad, I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
And he said, we're working on AI for better forecasting. And he laughed. And I don't know if they are or not, but, TSMC's forecasts are based on their customers, right? So their forecast is only as good as their customer forecast. And as we know, people just really screwed up their forecasts. And, rather than having a double-digit gain this year, TSMC is probably going to have a single-digit loss as far as percentage of revenue for.
Right.
And that's the first time I've seen that in my career with these guys. And so it's very concerning. But I do think it's at the bottom, it's a blip. I think next year, inventories are going to be depleted, and this whole recession thing is going to be over. But if you look at what's happening when Pat took over, it's the pandemic, it's the war in Ukraine, it's geopolitical uncertainty. China is a big part of Intel's business. And it's been a difficult time for him. So it's the worst of the worst. But if you look at what he's done during the worst of the worst period, you got to be impressed. And so just think about what he's going to be able to do when things turn around. Yeah, I have high hopes.
Well, I guess, and I bring this up not because I necessarily agree, because I really don't have an opinion on this either way. But I think that at least a lot of the people in the Moore's Law's Dead Discord who like to look at earnings and armchair analyze for fun and stuff, I think they look at like a year of bad earnings results every quarter, and they go, is Pat doing a good job? And if he is, how can we measure it? My argument would be, we just won't know for a year. Like, we need another year to see, because it takes time to do anything, implement anything, succeed at anything. So I can't say either way if Pat succeeded until there's been enough time to see if he has. But what would you say to the people, though, that go, well, how can you say he's done a good job? They're still behind. Revenue continues to go down every quarter. AMD's launching products before they are that cost less to make still. What are you seeing that tells you he is doing a good job already?
He got manufacturing back on track.
That's true.
Before he joined, there was a huge disconnect between design and manufacturing, and in Intel, and there was a huge disconnect elsewhere. And he really cleaned house, and he brought in his trusted few, and I think the turnaround would have happened much sooner without the other factors of the pandemic and the economy and inflation. But boy, if you think you'd be in better shape without Pat, you're wrong. Intel would be in much worse shape. And I think the prospects of them having a really good year next year, I think are pretty high.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a chance it could still look pretty bleak, though, for another quarter or two, but next year it should for sure turn around?
Next year, yeah. No, this year's going to suck. I mean,
okay.
TSMC said it, and, they're my bellwether, and, they have hundreds of customers, right? So, including AMD. So if TSMC says it's going to suck, it's going to suck. But they're saying next year is going to be a much better year. And I agree with that.
QH Freddy writes in and asks, do you see any similarities or differences between where Intel is going and where IBM went? Basically, and this is something people bring up because I caution people. I go, guys, I don't know if Intel, nothing lasts forever, but to say Intel is going to go out of business and then even the next 10 years is absurd. Really, the next 20 probably. But IBM still functions. Like, is there a chance it could be an IBM situation, though, if some of these things continue to not execute? Or do you think there's no chance it's like IBM where Intel becomes like half as big as, or I don't know what number, but like a shell of its former self? Do you think there's no chance of that happening, or do you actually see some similarities and give it a small chance?
I mean, it certainly could happen. But, when I got out of college, I interviewed with IBM. They were one of the big recruiters. And I chose not to go to IBM because I tell you, my feeling, and after I traveled back east, was that they were already a dinosaur, and there were so many other innovative companies in Silicon Valley. And, I thought to myself, I'm like, are they going to be around in 10 years? And I said, no, why would I want to go to work for that company? And this was in 1980. So they lasted a lot more than 10 years. But, they just didn't have a good CEO. They had a culture that wouldn't change. I think Intel has proven that wrong. They did change culture, and they do have a good CEO. So, and maybe it was a swim or sink type of thing. But I'm a big fan of CEOs. I will not invest in a company either financially or personally unless I'm really a big fan of the CEO. And I'll tell you, the top CEOs in the industry, C.C. Wei is at the top. Jensen from Nvidia is at the top. Lisa Su is at the top. Pat Gelsinger is definitely at the top. And this is just semiconductor companies that I know. And there's a few others. I'm warming up to Qualcomm's new CEO. I didn't like the last one, but I saw him speak and I spoke to him. But without a good CEO, you're not going to have a chance, right? And Intel does have a good CEO. And I tell you, a lot of people trust him, based on his experience with Intel. And he's got the personality. And, he's got an ego, and he's got, stubbornness. So I give them high chances just based on that.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it sounds like you're saying the difference is IBM didn't have the vision or leadership at the top, but you think Intel does. So at a minimum, it won't be as bad as IBM.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, all right. I have a few just kind of, wrap up questions here. We've gone through the main subjects, but I want to kind of parse through the lingering things we didn't quite touch on yet. So King Harkinian writes in and asks, hello, Tom and Mr. Nenni. Mr. Nenni mentioned on SemiWiki.com that TSMC 3 nanometer was a, in quotes, very important node compared to TSMC 5 nanometer. Could you elaborate on why? Is 3 nanometer going to last a very, very long time, and that's why you said it? Does it have specific impacts on the industry in other ways than its life cycle compared to previous nodes? Why is 3 nanometer so important compared to the other nodes, in your opinion?
Well, there's one big point is that it's the last of the FinFET nodes, right? And so if you look at TSMC's roadmap that they presented this week, is they have multiple versions of 3 nanometer, and they will continue to do so. The thing you need to know about FinFETs is open source. So there's a lot of FinFET development models and stuff that are open source that anybody can access. It came out of UC Berkeley. Everybody shares it. FinFETs was a phenomenal and maybe, a unrepeatable success. because of the open source. The next generation nanotubes and stuff are not open source. All these companies have to develop their own models. And this goes to the PDKs, right? They have to develop their own models, everything of their own PDKs, aging models. My God, those are very difficult. So I think it's going to be a much longer node because the nanotubes, the ecosystem is not ready. It's harder to design to. TSMC 3 is the easiest to design to because we've done this for so long. And it's not a big change, right?
It's the peak of the thing we've been doing for a while now.
It is. It's got, EUV went to many more layers than what 3 nanometer has. They actually scaled down the layers. It's a finely tuned process. It's the finest tuned process in the FinFET business, in the FinFET family. So it is going to be big. And people are going to stick with it because we have to learn how to design to nanotubes. It's a whole new design style. And is it going to be tough? I don't know, because I don't know of any design starts. So I think N3 is going to last a little bit longer. Maybe people will skip N2. Who knows? Except for Apple, of course, and some of the big ones that need the performance. But yeah, I think N3 is going to be historic.
Yeah, so basically like 3 nanometers, kind of like analogous to what 28 nanometer was. That was the stop of an era. The next one's going to take time to get to, basically.
Exactly. Going from 28 nanometer to FinFETs was a big deal. TSMC actually threw a huge amount of people at it. I remember one time they had over 100 people at Apple, trying to teach everybody how to design to FinFETs. And it wasn't an easy thing. And, the first FinFET process at TSMC was not the best. But we're so good at it now, and we're going to have to change. And let me tell you, the semiconductor guys don't like change. It messes with our day.
So Florida Man writes in, how much do you think TSMC would bump up pricing for 2 nanometer if they were unchecked by a foundry with similar silicon density?
Well, that's not how TSMC works. I know it's easy to say that, oh, yeah, they're the only one, so they're going to bump up pricing. That's not the way it works. It goes off cost models, and look at their margins. They're very good at maintaining their margins, but they haven't doubled their margins over the pandemic, taking advantage of people. Their costs have gone up, so their prices go up. But again, they're very customer centric, and they don't do that type of pricing games. I know at the board level and other things they do, but TSMC doesn't. Just look at their finances. Just look at their reports. They don't screw around with people.
So basically, so when you see prices going up, it's not really TSMC making them raise prices. Those companies decided to.
Exactly. And, TSMC is very front loaded, right? They have to build fabs. So, they do have more costs in the front end, depreciation, but, like on their older nodes, like 7 nanometer and 16 and 12 and 10 and whatever, I mean, they're just printing money there, right? So I don't see those costs going up at all. But the new nodes, man, they're expensive, right? Those new fabs in Arizona, so we're going to have to pay for those.
QH Freddy writes in, how important are partners of TSMC like AMD and Apple when it comes to pushing packaging innovation? How much of the innovation that we've seen in packaging came directly from TSMC, and how much of it just came from AMD or Apple coming up with this technology themselves? It's kind of funny is TSMC doesn't design chips, right? They don't do packaging. They didn't. They have to learn it from their customers. And that's the strength of TSMC because they're learning design from 100 different customers in different markets. So they're able to take all that experience and do a summation of it and say, this is what we need. They did the same thing with packaging. Their packaging partner was Xilinx. That's who started packaging. In fact, I put up a blog on TSMC's conference. I put up 5, and one of them's a packaging blog, and it goes through the history of their packaging. And so you might want to check it out. I think it's blog number 3 or blog number 4 of the conference. But they learned packaging from the Xilinx guys, and FPGAs were very big on packaging because they were putting multi-die, a couple of die and then a memory in one package. And then Apple took over, and the Apple packaging, the Infos and the SOIC. I mean, it came right from Apple. And Apple said, hey, we want to do this, this, and this. And TSMC said, okay, here's how we can do it. And TSMC invested a lot of money in packaging. And, I said in my article that it was a little shock to me when I saw them going into packaging because it's a low margin business. It's compared to wafers. And I'm like, well, why would they be doing this? This is crazy. But they're doing it to make their foundry sticky.
because once you go with packaging with TSMC, you can't leave TSMC. They're not going to do packaging on other people's die, right? You can't take a wafer from Samsung to TSMC and do packaging, right? You can do the other way around probably, but it makes the ecosystem even more sticky. So I think it's a brilliant move, and they made some good announcements at the conference on packaging, their 3D wafer fabric, 3D fabric and such. So I wrote about it. We're going to be writing more about it, but without Apple, they couldn't do this.
Mm-hmm. So like maybe TSMC is the easiest to work with on this, and they are a good partner in applying it in more places. But it was Apple, it was AMD that came up with this stuff, and it was them, is what you're saying.
And you know what happens is Apple, meeting with Apple is pretty funny, is they say, this is what we want, and then you ask for details. Well, why? They're not going to tell you, right? They just say, this is what we want, this is what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And then TSMC will come back and say, well, this is what we can do. And then Apple say, no, this is what we want. And then TSMC will come back and say, okay, this is what we can do. I mean, it's a huge collaboration, but there's nobody that pushes you harder than Apple. AMD's got a good relationship with them, but Apple writes the biggest checks, right? It's 20 to 25% of their revenue is Apple business. And that's just huge. So Apple totally changed the foundry game. And, a lot of people back then said, oh, Apple's going to ruin TSMC, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't buy it.
I guess I missed that. I don't know who said that, but I guess I wouldn't have been paying attention to those arguments anyways. But
this was 12 years ago. This was 12, 13 years ago. Oh, I remember fighting over this. Like, what are you talking about? So, but now TSMC has these strategic partnerships with multiple companies. So it's just getting stronger, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to the cost to make things, though, I have an interesting reader mail question here. Chris Rich writes in and asks, how much do you think AMD spent bringing Zen 4 to market? AMD have said that Zen 4C will be the same ISA as standard Zen 4, so presumably a different physical implementation of the same logical design. How expensive do you think it was to design Zen 4C next to Zen 4? Do you think this is a better approach than Intel's Big Little move, where they're basically having to fully design two entirely different architectures in parallel, right? Because Zen 4, Zen 4C, what I've been told is it's the same design. It's just one of them is denser. They go less for clock speed, go more for lower voltages, less space. And otherwise, they're basically the same IPC, same performance, but one's clocked lower and takes up less space. Like, how much more cost did it was it like they had to design two Zen 4s, 1.5 Zen 4s? Like, how much more do you think it costs to have this different version?
We call these iterations. And, if you're doing a greenfield design, which is a fresh design, brand new, that's the most expensive. Iterations mean you're doing, a development of an existing design. And this is one of the reasons why Apple is so successful in their chips is they're doing iterations, right? It's the same SoC. They're just adding more, doing iterations. It's a much cheaper way to do business, right? If you can. And Apple can. AMD is just doing an iteration. It's going to be much less expensive. I have no idea how much, but it's significant.
But yeah, so it's not even remotely in the same ballpark. Can't say if it's half as much, a quarter as much, but it's vastly cheaper than what Intel's doing, literally designing two architectures they then have to put together.
It's an iteration, yeah.
Okay. Let me see here. I know you have limited time, so I just want to maybe throw out a couple more at the very end. So, all right. Carbon Cry writes in, what are your thoughts on the use of machine learning tools in semiconductor EDA with recent announcements from Nvidia and Synopsys? How much will these impact chip design quality and development costs for a desired design performance? There's lots of interest on the big HPC leading edge use cases, but could these advances breathe new life to trailing nodes like 14 nanometer or even 28 nanometer, perhaps extending their useful lifetimes in many markets?
Yeah, so you hear the terms AI and machine learning, right?
Mm-hmm. A lot.
We've been using machine learning for some time. And, that's just learning from your experience. You do 1 billion simulations and then you see which ones, were relevant. And then next time you only have to do 500 million simulations and stuff like that. So we've been doing machine learning, and AI is fairly new, but AI is big in EDA and is big in manufacturing. TSMC talked about that. They're using AI to better optimize their processes and their yield and such. And I can tell you, we write about it almost every week, AI in EDA tools. So Synopsys, you're right, that they are leading the way, but Cadence is doing the same thing, and the rest of the guys are. it's a big part of semiconductor design because we do a lot of iterative things. We do a lot of simulations, and you can actually tell AI can look and say, hey, you don't have to do this many simulations, or hey, this is the part that's going to get difficult. They can look back at all of our experiences, which we have, years and years, and say, hey, here's how you can do it better. So, it's in our routing tools, it's in all of our tools. So I think we're just starting, but it is going to make a huge difference. I mean, AI will be a big part of the semiconductor industry, both internally and as a driver externally. We're going to spend a lot of money on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me know if I misunderstood you. You're basically saying too that, like, we've been making better and better and better tools. We've been using AI forever. Maybe now it's like getting to this, inflection point where it's making a much larger outsized impact. But you're saying our tools are always getting better, are always better utilizing past nodes and so on and so forth. And it's just accelerating, kind of.
Yeah, it's iterative on one hand, but it's also disruptive innovation on the other. And the thing is that doing chips is very difficult, and manufacturing semiconductors is really, really hard. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. In 40 years, I've seen just the most incredible things. And, I've been in meetings all over the world, and I'm never the smartest one in the meeting, not even close. And these guys, not only are they really bright, but they have egos, right? And you put those two together and you get results. So look at what we've done, over the last 40 years. It's just absolutely incredible. AI is just another thing. I mean, we've been working on this for a while. The key to AI, in fact, I studied AI in college. I did AI programming, 40 years ago. The issue with AI is you have to have a huge amount of processing power, huge. And we didn't have it, but we have it now. And we're developing even more. That's why people are building AI specific chips, because the more processing power you have, the more ability you have for AI. And so it's an arms race. It really is, for vendors and for countries and for everything. But you just wait. The mobile phone revolutionized semiconductors, right? The biggest driver, the biggest disruptive was the smartphone. AI is the next one.
Mm-hmm. All right. Final question. Cloud writes in, hi, Tom and Daniel. Jim Keller and Sam Zielouf recently launched a new silicon manufacturing startup called Atomic Semi. Judging from Sam's previous work, they're likely gearing up to use electron beam lithography for maskless fabrication for low volume and prototype silicon. There have been a recent rise of open source EDA tools such as OpenLane and even open source PDKs for trailing edge processes such as Skywater 130. Over the coming years, could we see silicon design and manufacturing become as accessible to researchers and hobbyists as PCB design and manufacturing is today? Or is it too niche to ever become cheap or sustainable enough for this kind of more niche versions of this business to flourish? Thanks for all the hard work.
Yeah, no, they're right. I have looked at Atomic Semi, and in fact, I have a podcast coming up with those guys. The thing is, there's a lot of different companies that are doing this, and eFabless is one company, and Skywater actually enables this. Google enables this. You can get free free wafer shuttles, free tools. You can actually develop planar designs on open source tools.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge you have is accountability. So, with TSMC hates open source tools because they're not silicon proven. There's no accountability. If somebody's designing with Cadence, Synopsys, or Siemens, there's accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a good design. And if the design doesn't work, TSMC's out of luck. They're out of money, right? They do these wafer shuttles, these test shuttles, and then they start ramping up, and the design doesn't work, then they don't make any money, right? So this is a difficult thing, but Skywater can do this. Mature nodes can do this. There are open source tools. There's open source IP. I mean, RISC-V is one of the trending topics on SemiWiki. It's been like that for over a year. That is free IP. That is an amazing thing. And so you have tools, you have IP, and then you have cheap processes and such. You can do this today. People are doing this. We've documented it. It's not a big interest to me because what we do is we research the best design practices for leading edge semiconductors, right? We already know how to design it, 0.13, right? So, not my market, but I have kept track of it. We have a wiki for open source tools. It's getting bigger every year. I don't think there's any problems. Universities have been doing this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Free shuttles and free tools and free ITP at universities. But for the small startup companies, it's out there already. But Atomic Semi, I understand what they're trying to do.
Yeah,
it's a good deal.
Okay, well, you said you had a heart out. I'm trying to meet you there, but you've teased it a few times. I mean, at the end here, tell people where they can listen to this podcast where you will be talking to the Atomic Semi people.
So it's called Semiconductor Insiders. It's carried by all the outlets. We have about 40,000 listeners thus far. And it's 2 years old. We publish one a week. And we just did one last week with the VP at Intel Foundry. And that was quite popular. I forget who we have this week. We have Quadric IO. And so it's a 20-minute discussion between me and the CEO or technical guy. And, we just cover the basics and talk about the technology. It's available on SemiWiki.com, of course, on the front page, or any of your podcast services, Google, Apple, Spotify, etc. And it's inspired by you. I started it after I did your podcast.
Well, I mean, I've noticed that and I'm sure you're inspiring other people yourself now as well. You get people talking, they talk to other people, then they talk to other people, and hopefully everyone gets smarter, or at least they have less blind spots because they talk to someone and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that, And I think that's really the biggest asset to me was I have a YouTube channel and this at the same time is removing the blind spots. And I appreciate an expert like you coming on Broken Silicon, of course, to remove those blind spots for gamers who frankly just like to argue online about this stuff for fun, but you make our arguments a little more grounded in reality and a little less silly. So thanks for coming on. Remember, it's Broken Silicon, everybody. Subscribe on any podcast app. Give us a review. Subscribe to Moore's Law Z on YouTube. Support us on Patreon. Ask us questions. Get this episode early and ad-free and exclusive podcasts as well. And thanks for coming on again, Dan, and thanks for listening, everybody. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guests questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, If you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Gareffa, Greg Pataki, Mohammed Akwari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, Little Germany, Dan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Judgebird, Brian Riggleman, Dr. Foreman, Sam Miller, Deke, Josh Law, The Mechanical Philosopher, Joe Foot, SNES Chalmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchuk, Andrew S., Frank Zielinski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Christopher Crossan, Joshua L. Herrera, Valco Malev, The Boss Haas, Nicholas Buckner, Spantum G. Spamtum, Jonathan, Lord Starstream, General Drips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Alex Vega, Gregorius Hacker, Dominique Koch, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Cameron, VentiCZ, HardForum.com, Original Ross, Zlicky, Lance Bassler, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, GZ Ziggy, Sarcastro, Stefan Hart, David Sebastian, Meat and Pork Stew, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jaskowiak, Travis Gooding, Holden Mobley, Nanyan, Chris Rich, Steepest Learners, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Chuck Glidden, Sammy Malas, Greg, A.W. Stanley, Patrick Groh, Will Chief, Brett Summers, Milton, Stephen Dick, Tommy, John, Brucha, Mark Mitchell, McDaffie, AC, James Anderson, Marshall Pierce, Mark Raidmaker, Dave Schultz, 3DS Boy 08, Al Buma, Joseph A. Madrigal, Matthew Landavazo, Stefan Koladik, Henry Zhang, Jensen N., Keith Moore, The Grid, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Joseph Kelly, Earth Taurus, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jerome Ferriera, RB Razor, Keith Moore, Michael Cozy, Ben, DNA Tech, Toka, John O'Shea, Royce Meyer, Charles Russell, Reginald Ari, Slushbot, Teague Autumn, Jackson Miller, JSMMH, Neithra Zink, Mean Dean, Richard Yell, Andre Shocks, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Seller, Jordan Simkovic, Loophole 35, Winstar, William Welpe, James I. Raider, Corey Leonard, Nell Lima, John Shin, Justin Bussell, John Swin, Austin Hagerty, Roger Davies, Shay Julian Leaked, Corey Capel, Evan Dingle, C2, John Iverson, Michael Aaron, The Eternal Dreamers, Jansen and Gima, Him Sagung, Derek Limbing, James Mosher, Kiko Sato, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.